of Worship, your source for commentary and discussion on worship, theology, and culture. I'm your host, Dr. Jonathan Michael Jones.
Hello and welcome to the Act of Worship podcast. This is Dr. Jonathan Michael Jones. Thank you for joining me today. We are in Psalm 114 today, and as I mentioned in the previous episode, Psalms 113 through 118 were sung and still are in many Jewish contexts during the Passover. And so Psalm 114 is one of those psalms. Jewish tradition assigned this psalm to the 8th day of Passover. And so in 8 short verses and with virtually unrivaled poetic subtlety, the psalmist describes the tremendous power of God's visual self-revelation called a theophany. A theophany is a visible manifestation of God's presence. So for example, in Exodus 13:21, when it says the Lord went before them as a pillar of a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night, that is a theophany. And so this describes God's power at the time of Israel's salvation from Egypt and into the entrance of Canaan. So let me read for you Psalm 114. It is a short psalm, but let's get into it. Psalm 114. When Israel went out from Egypt, the house of Jacob from a people of strange language, Judah became his sanctuary, Israel his dominion. The sea looked and fled. Jordan turned back. The mountains skipped like rams, the hills like lambs. What ails you, O sea, that you flee? O Jordan, that you turn back? O mountains, that you skip like rams? O hills like lambs? Tremble, O earth, at the presence of the Lord, at the presence of the God of Jacob, who turns the rock into a pool of water, the flint into a spring of water. So there's a lot of personification here. And again, just a great description of God's power in this psalm. So in verse 1, it says, when Israel went out from Egypt. The Exodus, you've probably realized by now through the Psalms, if you've listened to any of these podcasts, that the Exodus is mentioned frequently throughout the Psalms. The Exodus was the most tremendous display of God's redemptive power during the Old Testament period. And so it was constantly remembered and still is to this day. And it became a source of encouragement for later generations, including Christians who may perceive themselves as strangers and exiles in search of their true homeland. Hebrews 11:13 through 14 says, these all died in faith, not having received these things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. And so this is a comfort for God's people. And then in verse 2 it says, Judah became his sanctuary. The people and their country were God's sanctuary because God chose to be present with them. The tabernacle and then the temple were symbols of his presence. Verse 3, the sea looked and fled. So the Red Sea here is personified. You remember the Red Sea that was parted in Exodus 14 and 15. And so this poetically describes the crossing of the sea as a conflict between it and the Lord. Verse 14, the mountains skipped like rams, and more personification here. The mountains were symbols of power, firmness, and endurance. If you remember Psalm 46, it talks about God's strength and power. As powerful as great as the mountains are, God created them and is more powerful. So God's appearance shakes them like frightened rams. That's what it's talking about here. Verse 5, what ails you? The psalmist questions the poetically personified sea and mountains making explicit what was implicit in the first two stanzas of the poem here. And then in verse 7, tremble, O earth. When God comes in judgment and with power, the inhabitants of the earth should fear because they will be objects of his judgment, and nothing can stand in his way. Verse 8, who turns the rock into a pool. This is referencing God's provision at Kadesh, mentioned in Numbers chapter 20, when Moses struck the rock and water came from the rock to provide for the people of God. And so this was a demonstration of his power and also his compassion for his people. So as I said, it is a short psalm. The setting is rather short, certainly compared to many other psalms that I have set. I just finished Psalm 119, and the setting by itself is 37 minutes long. So when we get there pretty soon, you might need to take a nap before you finish Psalm 119. But here is Psalm 114 set to music. Thank you for listening today to the Active Worship Podcast. This is Dr. Jonathan Michael Jones.
When Israel went forth and all Jacob's house to leave Egypt's land and their foreign tongues, then Judah became his own holy place, and his dominion then became Israel. The sea looked and fled, the Jordan turned back, like rams mountains leaped, and hills skipped like lambs. What ails you, O sea, and why do you flee? O Jordan's flowing streams, why do you turn back? You mountains, oh why do you leap like rams? And why, all you hills, do you skip like lambs? Oh, earthquake before the Lord Jacob's God. He made the rock a pool, from flint made a spear.